Lippmann and the American Century, Chapter 4, Muckrakers and Socialists. I have a splendid little collection of letters informing me that I have botched my political career. Lippmann to Graham Wallace, July 31st, 1912. The Boston Common was both a high-minded and a cheery paper, exposing a moderate progressivism in the form of a public ownership of utilities and railroads. It promised its readers to be optimistic as a matter of habit. Such a sunny approach to politics was quite appropriate to the paper's sponsor, the Boston 1915 Reform Movement, organized by department store philanthropist Edward Flynn, and supported by such eminent citizens as Richard Dana, Louis D. Brandeis, Robert Treat Paine, and Charles Cabot. These men wanted reform. It was good for business, good for the city's image, and good for in itself. They were eager to expose corrupt politicians and the more sinful malefactors of privilege. It did not, of course, occur to them to make any fundamental changes in the economic structure, a structure that served them well, and whose working they so conspicuously represented. Lippmann had signed on enthusiastically, feeling that for all its good government, Google, as the cynics said, liberalism, the paper would give him valuable journalistic experience. It did not work out that way. Albertson, despite his earlier involvement with 20th Century magazine, knew little about putting out a weekly paper. And Charles Zoblin, the dashing socialist orator about town, knew even less. Lippmann soon grew discouraged. I have been with the paper since the beginning, he wrote Lincoln Stephens toward the end of May 1910. After only a few weeks on the job, and I see clearly that it would be a serious waste of time on my part to stay with it after the summer. His boss, he complained, had a one-sided notion of fairness, identical with the baldest statement of facts. Any attempt to find the meaning, or the tragedy, or the humor of the story is rigorously edited out as an expression of opinion, which belongs only in the editorial columns. The result is that I sit all day in the office reading newspaper clippings and trying to restate the facts as colorlessly as possible. The work is so mechanical that I'm learning nothing. I might as well be attached to a clipping bureau. Lippmann was doing more than complaining. He was angling for a job. He had first met Stephens in the fall of 1908 when a journalist was in Boston at Flynn's invitation, alerting the citizens to the corruption around them and admonishing them with his peculiar brand of Christian socialism to open their hearts to goodness. During that year, he had lectured at Harvard several times, treating the students for letting their teachers make decisions for them. Lippmann, not one to let a great man pass by, cornered Stephens with earnest questions about corruption in high places. A professional gadfly who had won a national reputation for his exposes of municipal graft, Stephens had graduated from the University of California at Berkeley, the year that Lippmann was born, sampled German universities for a few years, then returned to New York to become one of the great journalists of the day. His book, Shame of the Cities, based on a study of corruption he had written for McClure's magazine in 1902 and 1903, responded to and helped push a wave of civic reform. Yet he was no ordinary do-gooder. In his sardonic way, he enjoyed shocking people by insisting that everyone was corrupt, the good people no less than the sinners. The only way to salvation, he maintained, lay through confession and Christian redemption. Stephens knew everybody, from reform politicians like Tom Johnson of Cleveland and Brand Whitlock of Toledo, Ohio, to the bosses at Tammany Hall. He spoke their language. Although well-traveled and educated, Stephens was quite devoid of intellectual pretense. He loved to talk, to shock the innocent, to indulge in paradoxes. If anyone epitomized the era of the muckraker, its high-minded indignation, its low-level search for sensationalism, its earnest exposes for mass circulation magazines, it was Stephens. What I have dreamed of doing is to work under you, Lippmann wrote Stephens that May from Boston. Can you use me in your work? There is no position I should go at with more eagerness, because there is no kind of work that appeals to me as much as yours does. Money, he added, does not happen to be an important consideration for me at the present time. Opportunity to work and learn is the thing I'm looking for. Lippmann's letter could not have come at a better moment. Bored with the semi-retirement he had sunk into after his year in Boston, Stephens had joined the editorial staff of Everybody's magazine to do a new series of investigative articles. This time, he would analyze financial power, as he had earlier focused on municipal corruption. He needed a younger reporter to help him, and he also wanted to prove one of his pet theories, that a bright young man could learn to be a good journalist, even if he never covered night court or wrote obituaries. Stephens made a bet with his editors. Give me an intelligent college-educated man for a year, he told them, and I will make a good journalist out of him. Now Stephens was ready to try his experiment. I was going to look for a man something like you, Stephens responded to Lippmann's letter, explaining his bet with the editors of Everybody's and warning that the job was less glamorous than it sounded. My assistant would have to put a lot of time getting stuff for me and typewriting and doing a whole lot of manual labor, he warned. But my present subject is interesting. It would amount for you to making an investigation of the business and the politics of Wall Street under my direction. You would have to learn to investigate, but all the while I would be trying to get you ready to go and do likewise for yourself. The pay was low, only $15 a week, but opportunities to learn were unlimited. I will try to be square with you, but I want you very, very much. Hiring Lippmann was no snap decision. When Stephen first started thinking about an assistant, he asked around Harvard, as he later related, for the ablest mind that could express itself in writing. 3 names came up, and after a bit of discussion, everyone agreed on one. I found Lippmann, saw right away that his classmates saw in him, Stephen recounted. He asked me intelligent, not practical questions about my proposition. He caught on right away. Keen, quiet, industrious. He understood the meaning of all that he learned, and he asked the man he met for more than I had asked for. He searched them. I know because he searched me too for my ideas and theories. Lippmann did not care about the pay. He had allowance from his parents and was willing to live simply. Meeting with Stephens in Riverside, Connecticut. He, like what he found, quit his job on the Boston Common, and early in July 1910 moved into a small room at a club around the corner from Stephens' house. Aside from an assistant, Stephens also wanted a companion, someone he could go fishing with in the afternoons to get up to the house where his chronically ill wife, Josephine, lay slowly dying. Through the summer and fall, and most of the following winter, Lippmann worked with Stephens on the investigation of a financial power. The series, with Stephens called It, was meant to be a continuation of Tom Lawson's famous expose of Wall Street manipulations, but delving deeper into the structure of the business world. Lippmann was a Stephens legman, commuting between Lower Manhattan and Riverside, burrowing through financial reports and interviewing scores of people from stockbrokers to messenger boys, traveling through the East and the Middle West to Washington, Chicago, Kansas City, and Cleveland. Lippmann gathered his data on these trips, and at Stephens' side in New York, he met some of the leading figures in the progressive movement, men like Francis Henley, the California prosecutor, Rudolph Speckles, the Sugar Trust liberal, Fremont Alder, the crusading San Francisco editor, Tom Johnson, the retired reform mayor of Cleveland, and his successor, Newton Baker, and the writer-politician Brand Whitlock. After a few months of fact-gathering, Lippmann drew up a detailed report showing the secret arrangements between New York banks and the major financial houses on Wall Street. We were looking not for the evils of big business, but for its anatomy, Lippmann later explained. Stephens had made a bold and brilliant guess that running a business was like running a city. We found that the anatomy of a big business was strikingly like that of a Tammany Hall. The same pyramiding influence, the same tendency of power to center on individuals who did not necessarily sit in the official seats, the same effort of a human organization to grow independently of legal arrangements. At the end of the trail was the great banking house of J.P. Morgan, which controlled some 40 banks. The economic life of the country was organized by small groups of men, making short work of all legal formulae and exercising sovereignty regardless of little fences we erect to keep it in bounds. The material Stephens and Lippmann unearthed helped trigger the Puget Committee investigation, which in turn paved the way for the attempt to control the giant banks through the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. By the time Lippmann joined Stephens, the great days of the muckraker area were over. Muckraking had been based on the populist strain of progressivism, essentially a rural and small-town revolt against the big city and big business. The populist progressive movement directed its anger at the industrial trusts, the city political bosses, and the robber barons beyond the reach of the law. These loose and desperate and disparate conditions of reformers believed that men were essentially good and that a just society could be legislated into existence. To do this, they sought wider public participation through such electoral changes as initiative, referendum, and recall, the regulation of public ownership of utilities, and the destruction of the urban political machines. The muckraking journalists were the watchdogs of this movement, exposing the corruption of political machines, detailing the stronghold of the giant corporations, crying shame on the cities where immigrants and blacks were exploited. These journalists rose the middle-class conscience and made reform a mass movement. Through mass circulation magazines, they transformed scattered discontent into a national crusade. Such magazines as McClure's, which figured Ida Table's famous series on the Standard Oil Trust, Ray Stannard Baker's account of the Colorado mine strike, and Lincoln Stephens' report on city government, attracted a wide audience avid for tales of graft and corruption. At 10 or 15 cents a copy, these journals reached millions of readers. Though the muckrakers' criticism ran deep, their solutions were shallow. Dedicated to pre-industrial form of capitalism, they celebrated the virtues of the small entrepreneur, free competition, and equal opportunity for all. They were quite baffled by the new forms of industrial organization, and their impulse was to preach against it. Hence, their frequent appeals for confession and redemption, as though a change of heart would eliminate exploitation and privilege. Only the socialists, with their big city base, looked beyond the mere symptom of corruption toward a fundamental change in the social system. Eventually, Stephen himself adopted this view, moving left until he ended up in the 1930s among the communists. Stephens had made his reputation on paradox, extolling the party boss over the Google reformer, arguing that the common man was just as corrupt as the monopoly capitalist or the Tammany politician. To prove his point, he decided in December 1910 to show that Riverside's neighbor, prosperous, civic-minded Greenwich was as corrupt as any place in the nation. The Greenwich elders took up his challenge and arranged a town meeting for him to detail his charges. The press was, of course, alerted by Stephens himself, and on the appointed night the hall was packed with people who had come to watch Stephens try to prove the inconceivable. New York reporters scurried for front-row seats, prepared to give blow-by-blow accounts of how the great man had made a fool of himself. But Stephens had done his homework. He had assigned Lippmann to burrow through town records and interview people for evidence of shady dealings. He had also hired a black gardener to hang around street corners and eavesdrop on conversations. When the great night came around, Stephens was ready. As he stood on the rostrum explaining to a skeptical crowd how corruption could infect even the cleanest town, attentive Lippmann, described by the press as an admiring young man with glasses and an imposing collection of documents, draw a diagram of corruption on a blackboard. The audience shifted uneasily as Stephens explained how the people themselves had sanctioned a system that gave a special privilege to banks and business. Properly chastened, the audience dutifully passed a resolution declaring that Greenwich was indeed as corrupt as any town in the country. Stephens concluded the meeting with a sermon, telling the somewhat incredulous gathering that the remedy of all these things is Christianity. Although Lippmann was then an admiring young man, he later grew critical of Stephens' evangelical side and his intellectual laziness. He enjoyed his own somewhat paradoxical style and the writing of articles in that style more than he did the task of trying to collect facts. analyze them and read hard, difficult books about the facts. Lippmann later said, while Stephen was a man of great sweetness of character and kindness to people, he didn't work hard. He became increasingly a kind of Christian anarchist saint, detached from the realities of the world, one who seriously proclaimed that crooks were more honest than good men, and the path to honest government lay through emulating Jesus was too whimsical for a permanent diet. Nevertheless, some of Stephen's rubbed off on Lippmann. His skepticism about the inherent goodness of average man, his belief that corruption was an inherent part of the system, his insistence on uncluttered, declarative writing, his emphasis on intelligence, his admiration for strong leaders, and his faith in science. While doing research for Stephens, Lippmann kept up his ties with the Intercollegiate Socialist Society, spoke at college chapters to recruit new members, and in late December 10 attended the annual ISS convention in New York. Over the Christmas holidays, delegates from 12 colleges assembled at the Greenwich Village studio of Helen Phelps Stokes, a socialist sympathetic to the cause. Among the large group were Upton Sinclair, a fair-breathing young journalist, Morris Hillquid, one of the more sober party officials, Edwin Markham, a well-known writer, Jessica Finch, mistress of a fashionable girls' school, and as star attraction, a socialist member of the German Reichstag and a survivor of the Paris Commune of 1870. At the final dinner concluding the activities, Lippmann spoke to delegates on the place of college men and women in the socialist movement. With cautious practicality, he warned that students could be frightened away by too radical talk and by mannerism and habits of the typical agitators. Of all the things that Harvard disliked, he pointed out, bad taste was one, and the propaganda, therefore, must be carried on in good taste. Even though Harvard's social conscience was growing, he warned, we must not outrage it. The first articles in the Everybody's Money Power series rolled off the press in September 1910, just in time to make Walter's 21st birthday. Jacob and Dizzy, who were off touring Europe, found a copy of the magazine at Brentano's in Paris and sent Walter their congratulations on the excellent and interesting study, which they were quite sure will appeal to the intelligent reading public. Although Jacob, Lippmann's father, thought anyone on the left of President William Howard Taft a dangerous radical, he praised his son's article as clearly and concisely written, free of sophistry, and easily understood. Lippmann had done his job well, and Stephens was ready to collect on his bet. When William James died in the summer of 1910, Walter had written a tribute to the philosopher that Stephens had submitted to the editors under his own name. After the article was set in type, he revealed that the real author was his young cub. Stephens has proved that he could turn an untrained reporter into a polished journalist. In this case, he has had a head start. Lippmann was a good writer when he came to the magazine, but it was even better when he left. A year with Stephens had taught him some rules that he never forgot, that whatever he said had to be solidly based on the facts, that he should know exactly what he wanted to say before he sat down to write, and that, as he later said, if I wrote a paragraph about a fair down the street, I must write it with as much care as if that paragraph were going down in one of the anthologies. Here I want to stop that my understanding is actually for doing anything, you need to think clearly first and do it clearly and finally say it clearly. That's what I learned from one of my big boss. Let me continue to read. Lippmann may not have gained a great deal of intellectually from Stephens, but he learned something important about tolerance for human foibles, and the bemused acceptance of life's absurdities. He also learned how to please the man he admired. You often asked me whether the year had been worthwhile, he wrote Stephens when they had finished the series. Lord, if I could tell you and make you believe it, you would know then why everybody who knows you loves you. You give me yourself, and then you ask me whether it has been worthwhile. For that I cannot write down in my thanks. I shall have to live them. Whenever I understand a man and like him, instead of hating him or ignoring him, it will be your work. You have got into my blood, I think, and there will be a little less bile in the world as a result. You give me a chance to start. You know what that means to a fellow who has an indifferent world staring him in the face. If the world was not exactly indifferent to Lippmann, neither was it beating a path to his door. With the Money Power series completed, Stephen went off to England in the spring of 1911, leaving Lippmann at everybody's in what he called a dreary little job as sub-editor. Muckraking was passing after fashion, and the editors had no real assignment for him. Restless working as the first reader of manuscripts and the sorter out of jokes for a funny column. As he said later, he started writing on the side for the Socialist Monthly The International and the Socialist Anarchist masses. He also kept up his ties with the ISS and joined the Liberal Club. The club, still in its respectable uptown phase, was less liberal than its pretensions, as he discovered when he unsuccessfully put up for membership W.E.B. Dubois, the Harvard-educated black scholar who was his comrade on the board of the Socialist New Review. Not until the following year, when it moved down to Greenwich Village, did the club shed some of its prejudices. Although Lippmann considered himself a socialist and a radical, his militancy was tempered by a strong sense of practicality. In the signed editorial notes he wrote every month for the International from August 1911 to July 1912, he castigated those simple-minded socialists who believed that labor could do no wrong and capital no right, that all conflicts between them resolve themselves into conspiracies and persecutions by rich men of a poor man. Nor did he have any use for violence. You cannot plan a civilization on a heated powder mine, he said. He wrote of the labor bombing of a newspaper plant in Los Angeles. You cannot rearrange industrial processes, lay off the cities, solve the problems of food and work, devise uses for leisure, breed finer strains of a man on a battlefield. Not only was there nothing doctrinaire about Lippmann's socialism, there was not even much that was particularly socialist. One party militants promoted Eugene Debs, hero of the Pullman strike, for president. Lippmann leaned toward the moderate governor of New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson. It is more far-reaching importance that men should become liberal-minded than that they should believe in a radical creed, he wrote. What attracted Lippmann to socialism was not a fiery passion for justice and equality, as was the case with his friend John Reed, but an impatience with how badly society has managed. The Fabians, with their statistics, their elaborately detailed programs, and their emphasis on leadership from the top, were far more in key with his own temperaments than the well-meaning goo-goo reformers or the bomb-throwing labor militants. Society had to be organized, plans drawn up, the scientific method invoked. We cannot afford to start a crusade against every pimple on the face of American optimism, he complained in an attack on the sentimental reformers. Lippmann wanted to reform, what he called a radical constructive program, but he believed it had to come from the top, free from meddling by the masses or by do-gooders. His work with the Stephens had eroded whatever lingering faith he may have had in the wisdom of a common man. It was part of the cult of a democracy, he charged, to assume that the people have all the virtues and then pretend, when they don't exhibit them, that it is somebody else's fault. Political democracy was not so much a way of expressing the wisdom people have, as it is a way of enabling them to get wisdom. Such suspicion of a proletarian enthusiasm was more in line with the view of big city progressives than with that of American socialists, who, as Lippmann complained, downgraded the leadership, exalted the masses, and hold as a dogma to which all are expected to subscribe, that initiative springs anonymously out of the mass of the people. Such iconoclasm failed to rattle his fellow socialists, many of whom shared his suspicion of the masses. As an editorialist for journals like the International and the Call, Lippmann was much in demand as a speaker and writer of tracts, and many predicted a brilliant future for him within the party. When the party faithful gathered shortly after Christmas 1911 at Jessica Finch's elegant finishing school for the annual ISS convention, Lippmann was one of the leading younger members of a movement that seemed the wave of the future. Socialist mayors ran 33 American cities, and Eugene Debs was preparing to carry the party banner for the presidency. Among the new breed of socialist politicians were the Reverend George Loewen, a mild-mannered reformer who had just been elected mayor of Schenectady, New York, on a good government ticket. Loewen, being inexperienced in politics and shaky on socialism, was looking for a bright young man whom he could take to Schenectady as an assistant. Hugh Quaid introduced him to Lippmann, who knew even less than Loewen about politics, but had a bagful of theories about socialism that he wanted to try out, and was bored at Everybody's magazine. Lippmann asked Loewen a few practical questions about the kind of work he would be doing and decided to give it a try. He and Lewin exchanged a comradely handshake in one of Jessica Finch's empty classrooms, and he went home to 80th Street to pack a few shirts and some books. When the new mayor took office on New Year's Day, 1912, Lippmann was already stationed at his desk just outside Lewin's door. At the beginning, it was all very exhilarating. John Macy, another young socialist who was married to Annie Sullivan, the teacher of Helen Keller, worked at Lippmann's side and promised to enlist his wife's former pupil, herself an ardent socialist, to serve on the welfare board. Charles Steinmetz, the engineering genius of General Electric, helped him plan strategy, and a prominent socialist from New York came by to lend support. At Lewin's side, Lippmann wrote speeches, drafted the bills for the city council, met with ward bosses and the union officials, and fed stories to journalists. After 2 months on the job, he reported approvingly to the readers of the masses that an enormous amount of dust had been removed and a great many rusty joints oiled. But once the dust was removed, Lewin did not do much else. He knew he had been elected not because the voters embraced socialism, but because they wanted to get rid of the scoundrels in office. In his inaugural address, he had admitted that we cannot abolish the capitalist system in Schenectady. Afraid to alienate the moderates, Lewin decided to please the public by providing more services, such as playgrounds, cheap ice and coal, and milk inspection. The moderates were appeased, but the socialists began to feel they had been cheated. They expected Lewin to take over the utilities and streetcars, to challenge the power structure. When he proved more timid than they had imagined, they accused him of being an opportunist. Lippmann prodded Lewin to move more boldly, but the mayor could not be budged. Finally, after 4 months of frustration, Lippmann gave up. He had no patience for politicians, and even less for ward heelers, union officials, and favor-seeking voters. He had had his taste of practical politics and did not much like what he saw. The whole experience had been disillusioning. The voters were unripe for socialism. The mechanics of government were tiresome. The petty vexations piled into mountains. He wrote of his political apprenticeship. Distracting details scatter and attention and break up thinking, while the mere problem of exercising power crowds out speculation about what to do with it. Constant speech-making turns a man back upon a convenient little store of platitudes. His irritation was as much with the voters and with the whole mechanism of a government as with Lewin's lapses from socialist doctrine. Having tried practical politics and found it not to his liking, he elevated his dislike to a matter of principle. In defending his sudden departure from Schenectady, he put the blame on Lewin, the mayor. He charged was not a dedicated socialist. Having gone over to the attack, he struck at Lewin's weakest point. The mayor's administration, he wrote in New York Call magazine, a socialist weekly, was paralyzed by timidity of action, the lack of a bold plan, a kind of aimlessness. Instead of paving the path for socialism, it was content with mere reform, a sharp object lesson in what always results when we turn from education to politics. when we seek to win voters rather than to make converts. Sounding a radical note, he warned that the socialists could not be mere reformers. Reform under the fear of radicalism is an educative thing. Reform pretending to be radicalism is deadening. This line of attack was ironic, considering Lippmann's own skepticism about socialist doctrine, but it had the desired effect. His blast set off a new schism in the ranks. Morris Hillquit, a spokesperson for the moderates, accused Lippmann of being unrealistic. The party could not drag people further toward socialism than they were willing to go. Some of the militants, he predicted, will sooner or later sober up. Others will quit the uninteresting socialist movement in disgust. Lippmann was unmoved. Socialists should not play it safe, he retorted the following week. Those who sought to be shrewdly good should come out flatly for the biggest truth they seek. Nothing but they will save them from little successes, from the self-sanctification that comes of a gumshoe morality. Comrades had to distinguish between socialist power and the external claptrap of a victory. For months the debate echoed in the Call and the other socialist journals, with the Fabians supporting Lippmann and the more cautious defending Mayor Lewin. Lippmann returned to New York City in May 1912. The taunts of socialist regulars like Hillquit ringing in his ears. He felt defensive, and yet convinced he had done the right thing in leaving Schenectady. I fought as hard as I could within the organization without any result, he wrote Graham Wallace. When I saw that the policy and the program were settled, I resigned and attacked the administration. This brought down upon me the wrath of the leaders. My analysis was ignored, but I was the subject of the most careful and bitter attention for several weeks. Lippmann was unrepentant. The whole affair is very objective to me, he insisted. I have a splendid little collection of letters informing me that I have botched my political career, but as the only interest a career would have is the chance to understand the politics a little more directly, I really feel elated that mine was so compressed that I can already look back upon it. It was not long before even the most patient socialists became disenchanted with what was happening in Schenectady. Such a difficult word. John McKay, who had replaced Lippmann as the mayor's assistant, resigned at the end of the summer, taking with him his wife and Helen Keller. Even Hillquit eventually resigned his post on the mayor's staff. Along with Ben Henry, star writer for the pro-socialist Schenectady Citizen. Ultimately, the party expelled Lewin, and he switched over to the Democrats, with whom he had a happy and continuing career. At 22, Lippmann already had a good deal to look back on. 2 months as a cop reporter in Boston, a year with Stephens, a column on politics in the International, 4 months in Schenectady, some practical experience in politics, expanding number of contacts, and a pile of clippings to show that his voice was being heard. Since 1909, he had been a registered member of the Fabian Society, carrying his card and paying his £1 sterling annual dues. He was a militant socialist, also he thought, but the experience at Schenectady had led him to wonder whether the people would ever be ready for the great social changes that seemed so necessary, whether in fact, as he wrote caustically, Soup and socialism were middle-class fads. The socialists blamed special privilege for their failures. But as Lippmann later wrote, it always seemed that we were like a peer god, struggling against a formless bog, invisible yet everywhere. We were struggling with the unwatered hinterland of the citizens of Schenectady. Already he was concerned by the great dull mass of people who just don't care, by a tyrannical public opinion. No financial power is one-tenth so corrupting, so insidious, so hostile to originality, and frank statement. He complained of his experience on Everybody's magazine as the fear of the public which reads the magazine for one atom surprised act of respect for a railroad or a bank. Nine are rejected because of the prejudices of the public. The public's prejudices was to trouble him increasingly. Nearly 4 decades later, his friend Bernard Branson commented on this impatience with the public. The trouble, if any, with Walter Lippmann is that he tends to treat politics as a series of problems, almost geometrically, and fails to take into sufficient account that the politics consists not merely of abstract good and evil, but chiefly of the human material engaged, whether as executors or public. Branson wrote in his diary, ever so much that would be feasible and rational with reasonable beings is anything but possible with inertia, tropism for the immediate advantages, and impulsive greed. They play havoc with the proposals of the noblest legislators and dispose according to their fundamental urges. In Walter Lippmann, again and again, I have felt impatience with such considerations and indignation with the fools who would not attend his benefits. End quote. That impatience was there from the start. The events of the winter and spring of 1912 had been dispiriting, and by June, Lippmann was eager to get away from New York. His parents had gone off to Europe, leaving him in the house with the maids, and the city was oppressive with summer heat and socialist polemics. Shortly after he had returned from Schenectady, Mitchell Kennerly, a brash young Anglo-Irishman who had just set up his own publishing house, urged him to write a short book on politics. Lippmann decided he might as well give it a try. Enlisting his Harvard friend Alfred Booth Kuldner as a companion, he set out for the Rangeley Lakes in the backwoods of Maine, hoping to put together a little book of heretical thoughts. That's the end of chapter 4.